The heat of late July in Andalusia was a physical presence. It shimmered in waves above the asphalt, turning the distant, rolling hills into a hazy, dreamlike landscape. Beside me, Matteo drove our rented seat with a casual, one-handed grace, his other hand resting on my knee. He was talking, his voice a happy, excited murmur against the backdrop of the car's air conditioner, pointing out ancient olive groves and dusty white villages perched on hillsides like forgotten crowns. I tried to focus on his words, on the radiant love I felt for him, but my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. We were on our way to Las Vegas de Plata, his family's ancestral home, the place where I, Claire Harrison, a girl from suburban Ohio, was to be presented for inspection. "You'll love it, me, Amor," he said, squeezing my knee. "The house is old, but the wine is good, and my mother... Well, she has a good heart, I promise. She is just traditional." Traditional was the word Matteo always used when describing his mother, Isabella Vargas. It was a gentle euphemism, a verbal cloak thrown over something I suspected was far more formidable. I had spent the last 4 years of my life immersed in the world that had shaped her, completing my doctorate on the court painter Diego Velázquez. I had deconstructed the rigid etiquette of the 17th century Spanish court, the intricate dance of power, pride, and public perception. I knew that in Spain, traditional could mean many things, and not all of them were good. My fluency in Castilian Spanish, a secret I had kept from Matteo for the simple, romantic reason that I loved hearing him try to explain his world to me in his charming, accented English, was about to be put to a very different use. I had intended to reveal it over dinner one night, a fun, surprising flourish. Now, a knot of apprehension in my gut told me to keep my secret weapon, HOLSTERED. We turned off the main road and onto a private gravel lane. A pair of magnificent, wrought iron gates stood open between 2 stone pillars, each topped with a carved lion. A small bronze plaque read Las Vegas de Plata, the Silver Vineyards. As we drove down the long, cypress-lined driveway, the finca came into view. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. A sprawling 2-story structure of ochre-colored stone and dark wood, draped in bougainvillea so red it looked like it was bleeding against the sun-bleached walls. It was ancient, elegant, and profoundly intimidating. It was the kind of house that had stood for centuries, a silent witness to births, deaths, and the quiet, ruthless preservation of a family's legacy, and it was about to be my judge. Isabella Vargas was waiting for us on the grand, terracotta-tiled veranda. She was exactly as I had pictured her, tall, impossibly elegant in a simple but clearly expensive linen dress, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into a severe chignon. Her face was a mask of cool, aristocratic composure. She smiled as Matteo bounded up the steps and kissed her on both cheeks. But the smile did not quite reach her eyes. "Mama, this is Claire," Matteo said, beaming, pulling me forward. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Mrs. Vargas," I said, extending my hand. My voice sounded ridiculously American in the still, heavy air. She took my hand, her grip light and fleeting. Her eyes swept over me, a rapid, top-to-bottom appraisal that took in my simple sundress, my practical flats, and my hopeful, nervous smile. "Isabella, please," she said, her English as crisp and starched as a new banknote. "Welcome to our home. You must be tired from your journey." It was a statement of welcome, but it felt like a diagnosis of a condition. Before I could respond, 2 younger women emerged from the cool darkness of the house. They were mirror images of each other, tall and sleek in designer shorts, their dark hair falling in glossy waves. Carmen and Elena, the sisters. They greeted Matteo with a flurry of loud, affectionate Spanish, then turned their identical, critical gazes on me. "So, this is the American, Carmen, the bolder of the 2, said in Spanish, looking me over as if I were a piece of livestock at auction. She turned to her mother, a small, conspiratorial smile playing on her lips. Myra su vestido, mama, tan sencilla. Look at her dress, mama, so simple. Practica puris in alma, Elena added with a tiny, almost imperceptible sneer. Practical, but without a soul. I felt the first sharp sting of their words. I kept the pleasant, slightly vacant smile fixed on my face, pretending to be lost in their rapid-fire conversation. Mateo, oblivious, just laughed. Okay, enough, he said in English, patting my arm. Speak English, please. Claire doesn't understand. Of course, darling, Isabella said smoothly, her eyes twinkling with a cold amusement. She turned to me. My daughters are just saying how fresh you look. It is a very American quality, no? That freshness. They led me on a tour of the ground floor. It was like walking through a wing of the Prado Museum, the museum I had practically lived in for 2 years. Dark, heavy furniture stood on worn Persian rugs. The walls were covered in portraits of grim-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow me with silent disapproval. Mateo pointed everything out with boyish pride, while his sisters trailed behind us, keeping up a running commentary in Spanish. La casa la intimida. Carmen whispered to Elena as I stood looking at a magnificent 17th century tapestry. The house intimidates her, claro. Probablemente su casa es de ellas de cartón que construyen en un día, Elena murmured back. Of course, her house is probably one of those cardboard ones they build in a day. I felt a flush of anger creep up my neck, but I forced it down. I smiled at Mateo and said, It's breathtaking. The history here is incredible. In the grand, formal living room, a servant brought out a tray with a decanter of sherry and small, delicate glasses. Isabella poured a glass for me herself. You must try our fino, she said. It is from Jerez, very old, very dry. I took a sip. It was exquisite, with a complex, nutty flavor. I knew this particular vintage. I had read about the bodega it came from. I was about to say so when I caught Elena's whisper to Carmen. Mira como lo baby. Como si fuera agua. No tiene ni idea. Look at how she drinks it, as if it were water. She has no idea. Seguro que prefiere esa Coca-Cola que beben todos, con mucho hilo, Carmen giggled. I'm sure she prefers that Coca-Cola they all drink with lots of ice. I put the glass down, my polite smile feeling like a hardening mask of cement. I had been here less than an hour, and they had already judged and condemned me as a classless, uncultured simpleton. And Mateo, my wonderful, loving Mateo, stood beside me, completely deaf to the poison they were pouring in my ear. He thought their rapid Spanish was a sign of their excitement. He was so proud to show me his world. He couldn't see that his world was trying to reject me. That evening, I unpacked in the guest suite, a cavernous room with a bed so large I felt lost in it. The windows looked out over the vineyards, rows upon rows of grapevines, stretching out to the horizon, bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. It was a scene of perfect pastoral beauty, but I felt a profound sense of dread. I had made my decision. I would not reveal my secret. Not yet. To do so now would be an act of open aggression, a declaration of war on my first day. I loved Mateo, and I wanted this to work. I told myself this was just a test, that they were just feeling me out. I told myself their coldness was a defense mechanism, the caution of an old family faced with an outsider. I would be patient. I would be gracious. I would win them over with my kindness and intelligence. I would prove them wrong, as I stood there, watching the sun bleed across the Spanish sky. I thought of the court of Philip IV. I thought of the ambassadors and ladies-in-waiting, the way they moved through the halls of the Alcazar, their fans, hiding secrets, their polite words dripping with venom. I was an art historian. I was a scholar of observation. I would treat the Vargas family as my new subject. I would watch, I would listen, and I would learn their weaknesses. I would absorb their insults, collecting each one like a piece of data. My patience was my greatest academic skill. I would use it now for my heart. I would endure. I had no idea how much I would be asked to endure. The first morning at Las Venas de Plata, I awoke with a renewed, if fragile, sense of determination. I convinced myself that the previous evening's chilliness was a product of their surprise and my own jet-lagged sensitivity. Today, I would make a proper effort. I was not just Mateo's girlfriend. I was an art historian with a deep and genuine appreciation for their culture. Surely that was a bridge we could cross. I found Isabella in the Grand Salon, a room with ceilings so high it felt more like a chapel than a living space. She was arranging a bouquet of lilac in a large ceramic vase. The vase, I noted with a silent academic thrill, was a magnificent piece of 17th century Talavera pottery. "Good morning, Isabella," I said, my voice bright. "Those flowers are beautiful. One must find ways to bring life into these old rooms," she replied without turning around. "Otherwise, the ghosts of the past become too loud." "Is that vase from the Ruiz de Luna workshop?" I asked, venturing into my area of expertise. "The blue is so distinctive. It looks like their work from the late 1600s. She finally turned. Her perfectly plucked eyebrows raised a fraction of a millimeter. She was surprised I knew the name. For a fleeting second, I thought I had found an opening. Her expression, however, quickly reverted to its default mode of cool indifference. "A family heirloom," she said dismissively, as if to say, "Of course you wouldn't understand." She turned back to her flowers, then spoke over her shoulder in Spanish, her voice low, as if to herself, but loud enough for me to hear perfectly. "Intenta impresionar con sus pequeños conocimientos." She's trying to impress with her little bits of knowledge. The bridge I had hoped to build crumbled before I had even laid the first stone. I murmured something about getting some coffee and retreated, the politest of smiles fixed on my face, while the insult settled like a cold stone in my stomach. The week that followed was a slow, meticulous dissection of my spirit. The family's assaults were never overt, never a single dramatic confrontation. They were a campaign of 1,000 cuts, of subtle slights and whispered insults, all delivered with a veneer of impeccable politeness. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, and I was the sole, solitary target. Meals were the primary battleground. I would sit at the long, polished mahogany table, trying to make pleasant conversation in English, while the three of them would maintain a parallel conversation in Spanish, a secret river of commentary flowing right past me. At one lunch, the topic turned to travel. Carmen and Elena spoke at length about their recent shopping trip to Milan. "And you, Claire?" Carmen asked, turning to me, her expression one of mock interest. "Do you enjoy traveling in Europe?" "Very much," I said. "I spent a summer in Florence, and I loved my time in Paris." "Ah, Paris," Elena sighed dramatically. "But the French can be so arrogant, don't you think?" She then turned to her sister and added in Spanish, "No tanto como los americanos, claro." Not as arrogant as the Americans, of course. They both shared a tiny, conspiratorial smirk. I smiled blandly and took a sip of water. Mateo, bless his oblivious heart, jumped in to defend me. "Claire is not like that at all. She is the most down-to-earth person I know." He was a man trying to douse a fire with a water pistol, completely unaware that the fire was being fueled by a language he refused to see as a weapon. The next day, the sisters insisted on taking me shopping in the nearby town of Ronda, a beautiful place perched on a cliffside. Their generosity, however, was a Trojan horse. They led me into a series of incredibly expensive, high-fashion boutiques. Places where a single silk scarf cost more than my monthly student loan payment. They would pull dresses from the racks and hold them up for me to see. "Oh, Claire, this would look divine on you," Carmen would exclaim, holding up a dress that was beautiful but entirely too flamboyant for my taste. She would then glance at the price tag and say to Elena in Spanish, with feigned sympathy, "Una pena que cueste más que su billete de avión." A shame it costs more than her plane ticket. They cornered me into letting them buy me a gift. Large, garishly patterned silk scarf that looked like something a flamboyant artist would wear. A souvenir from Andalusia. Elena chirped as she had it wrapped in tissue paper. As we left the store, I heard her whisper to Carmen, Veras, "Como se lo pon pensando que es el último grito en moda? Que gracioso." You'll see she'll wear it thinking it's the height of fashion. How funny. I folded the scarf and put it in my bag, my smile feeling brittle enough to crack. Each evening, I would try to talk to Mateo. I would try to explain. The coldness I felt, the sense of being constantly excluded and judged. "Mateo, honey," I said one night as we sat on the private balcony of our suite, "I am not sure your mother likes me very much." He looked genuinely surprised. "What? Mi amor, don't be silly. She's crazy about you. She told me yesterday she finds your perspective refreshing." I knew exactly what his mother had said because I had overheard it. What she had said in Spanish was, "Su perspectiva es tan simple que resulta casi refrescante como un vaso de agua sin gas." Her perspective is so simple, it's almost refreshing. Like a glass of uncarbonated water. The insult was in the nuance, the faint praise designed to damn. Mateo, hearing only the word refreshing, had accepted it as a compliment. And my sisters, I tried again. They only ever speak Spanish. Around me, it feels like they don't want me to be part of the conversation. "Oh, that's just how they are," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "They talk so fast their English can't keep up." "They don't mean anything by it, Claire." "Honestly, you're being too sensitive. This is just how European families are. They're more direct. Just give it time. They will warm up." It was in that moment, as he invalidated my feelings with his lazy, convenient cultural generalization, that I realized the truth. I was utterly and completely on my own. He was not my ally here. He was a product of this environment, and his love for me was not strong enough to make him see the poison that was being so politely administered to me every single day. My hope of winning them over died, and in its place, something colder began to grow. A turning point came on a Thursday afternoon. I had escaped to a secluded part of the garden, a small walled-in courtyard with a bubbling fountain and the shade of an ancient gnarled olive tree. I was trying to read, to lose myself in a book on Goya's black paintings, but I couldn't concentrate. I felt a profound sense of despair. I was about to give up and go back inside when I heard Isabella's voice from the other side of the high hedge. She was on the phone, her voice sharp and clear in the still afternoon air. "Say, Consuelo, Isela." "La Americana," she was saying. Yes, Consuelo, it's her, the American. She was clearly talking to one of her society friends. "Es agradable? Supongo, inofensiva. Pero, por Dios, no tiene nada. En hay familia, en hay historia, en hay conversation. No entiendo que ve Mateo and Ella. She's pleasant, I suppose, harmless, but my God, she has nothing. No family, no history, no conversation. I don't understand what Mateo sees in her." There was a pause as her friend spoke. Then Isabella laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Una casa fortunas? No, no creo que si tan lista. A gold digger? No, I don't think she's that smart. Simplemente. Es una niña deslumbrada por todo esto. El venido, el nombre de la familia. Es patético en realidad. Para Mateo está encaprichado. Esperemos que sea una phase. Como quella vez que le dio por el batismo? She's simply a girl who is dazzled by all this, the vineyard, the family name. It's pathetic, really, but Mateo is infatuated. Let's hope it's a phase. Like that time he got into Buddhism. I sat frozen on the stone bench, the book falling from my lap. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking me with pinpoint accuracy, harmless, simple, pathetic. That was their true, unvarnished assessment of me. All my attempts at kindness, my patience, my efforts to show them my intelligence, it had all been for nothing. They had made up their minds about me before I had even arrived. My nationality was my crime, and my personality was irrelevant. Pain was sharp and visceral. But as I sat there, listening to the water bubble in the fountain, the pain began to transmute. It cooled, it hardened, it sharpened into a single focused point of rage. But it was a quiet rage, a cold rage, an academic rage. I was no longer a hopeful fiancée trying to win over her future family. I was a scholar who had just been presented with a wealth of primary source material. My objective changed. I was no longer trying to earn their approval. That was a fool's errand. My new objective was to observe, to listen, and to collect. I began to actively seek out their Spanish conversations, lingering in doorways, picking up a magazine in rooms where they were talking. Every insult, every sneer, every piece of casual cruelty, I collected them. I memorized their phrasing, their idiomatic expressions, their tone. I filed them away in a neat, orderly catalog in my mind. I was no longer enduring their attacks. I was compiling my evidence, I was building my case, and I would wait for the perfect moment to present my findings. The moment when it would cause the most damage, the most humiliation. The moment when they were at their most proud, their most arrogant. The polite, smiling, ignorant American girl was my cover. And underneath it, a prosecutor was preparing for the trial of a lifetime. Thursday, July 31st, 2025, the day of my official introduction to society. The day I was to be presented, weighed, and measured. As I stood before the full-length antique mirror in our guest suite, I felt a strange and unsettling calm. The nervous, hopeful girl who had arrived a week ago was gone, and her place was a quiet, watchful strategist. I was not a fiancé preparing for a party. I was a soldier dressing for battle. I chose my armor with care, a simple, sleeveless black dress of impeccable cut and fabric. It was elegant, timeless, and understated. It offered no overt targets. My only jewelry was a pair of small pearl earrings, a gift from my late grandmother. My hair was pulled back in a clean, severe chignon, mimicking, with a touch of irony, the style of my tormentor, Isabella. I looked poised, confident, and entirely un-American by their standards. I was ready. Downstairs, the estate was transforming. Armies of caterers and staff moved with quiet efficiency. The long dining room table was set for 20, gleaming, with silver, crystal, and candles. The air smelled of beeswax and blooming jasmine. It was a scene of breathtaking, old-world elegance, a carefully constructed theater designed to impress and intimidate. And tonight I was the unwilling star of the show. Mateo found me by the French doors leading to the veranda. He looked impossibly handsome in a dark suit. He took my hands in his. "You look... Wow, Claire. A spectacular," he said, his eyes full of genuine admiration. "Are you nervous?" "A little," I lied. I was not nervous. I was coiled. I was a spring wound tighter and tighter with every passing insult of the last week. "Don't be," he said, kissing my forehead. "Just be yourself. They're all going to love you." The tragic innocence of that statement almost made me laugh. He still had no idea. He moved through his world shielded by a lifetime of privilege and the willful ignorance of a man who has never been forced to look into the darker corners of his own family. He saw a dinner party, I saw a tribunal. The guests began to arrive. As the sun set, a river of old money and older names flowing into the house. They were the landed gentry of Andalusia, vintners with estates even larger than this one, surgeons from Seville, lawyers from Madrid. They were all impossibly chic. Their greetings a flurry of air kisses and rapid-fire Spanish. Mateo introduced me to each of them. I smiled, I nodded, I endured their polite, probing gazes. To them, I was a curiosity. The American, Mateo's latest and most exotic project. We moved into the grand dining room, a cavernous space with a large, dark oil painting of a grim-faced Vargas ancestor looming over the proceedings. I was seated between Mateo and an elderly, rotund man named Mr. Delatour, who spoke a little English and seemed friendly enough. Directly across the table from me, however, was the tribunal itself. Isabella, flanked by her 2 loyal lieutenants. Carmen and Elena the dinner began, and so did the assault. It was, as always, a masterclass in subtlety. With the first course, a chilled almond and garlic soup called Ajo Blanco, Carmen leaned towards me with a bright, fake smile. "Do you like it, Claire?" she asked in English. "It is a very traditional taste. It's delicious," I said honestly. She turned to her sister and, in a stage whisper of Spanish, said, "Un milagro que no haya pedido una hamburguesa." A miracle she hasn't asked for a hamburger. The sisters shared a quick, venomous little laugh. I felt Mr. de la Tour, my dinner partner, shift uncomfortably in his seat. He had heard. He knew, but like everyone else, he said nothing. With the main course, a magnificent dish of slow-roasted Iberian pork, the conversation turned to global affairs. Someone mentioned a recent American political headline. I listened for a while before offering a mild, well-reasoned opinion on the matter. Isabella, who had been holding court at her end of the table, caught her eyes towards me. She gave a delicate, dismissive wave of her hand and said to the man beside her, a prominent banker, in her crystal-clear Spanish, los americanos siempre tienen una opinión sobre todo, ¿verdad? Hizo problema decir un país sin opiniones historia. Syrian que todo empezó con ellos. Oh, the Americans. They always have an opinion on everything, don't they? It's the problem with being a country with hardly any history. They think everything started with them. The banker chuckled politely. Mateo, hearing the tone but not the words, assumed his mother was engaging me in a friendly debate. He beamed at me from across the table, a look of pride on his face. Look, his expression seemed to say, "She likes you." The disconnect, the chasm, between what I was experiencing and what he was perceiving was so vast it gave me a kind of vertigo. I felt my anger, the cold, quiet rage I had been nurturing all week, solidify into something else. It was no longer anger, it was resolve. My desire to please was a distant memory, a foolish dream from another lifetime. My new desire was simpler. It was the desire for justice, for the satisfaction of seeing their smug, arrogant faces when they finally realized their quiet, simple American mouse was, in fact, a lion who understood every single word. The final piece of ammunition was provided by Elena. She had been watching Mateo fuss over me, making sure my wine glass was full, translating a joke for me that wasn't funny in the first place. She leaned over to her mother, Pobre Mateo. She sighed, her voice dripping with pity. "Por tan cansado ultimamente. Este experimento internacional debe de ser agotador para él." Poor Mateo. He looks so tired lately. This international experiment must be exhausting for him. International experiment. That's what I was. A project. A phase. A curiosity to be indulged until he grew bored of it. It was the last piece of evidence. I needed The case was closed. The verdict was in. They were guilty on all counts. And I, the judge and jury, was about to deliver the sentence. The breaking point arrived with dessert, a light, airy meringue confection. An old family friend, a duchess of some minor, forgotten title, raised her glass to toast Isabella, to our magnificent hostess, and to the continued good fortune of the Vargas family. Isabella inclined her head, accepting the praise as her due. Thank you, Maria. Her eyes scanned the table, a queen surveying her court. She looked at Mateo, a genuine warmth in her expression. Then her gaze fell on me, and the warmth vanished, replaced by a cool, dismissive shadow. It is a mother's greatest wish to see her children happy and well-matched. Isabella began, her voice carrying across the table. Her Spanish was slow, deliberate, each word chosen for maximum effect. This was not a whisper. This was a proclamation. I remember when Mateo was with Ines, she said, naming his ex-girlfriend, the daughter of a duke. Her family has been part of the history of Andalusia for 500 years. They understood each other. They moved in the same world. She paused, taking a slow, deliberate sip of wine. She was setting the stage, and I knew with a horrible, thrilling certainty that I was the subject of her final act. ESACQ era una mujer con mundo y cultura, she said, her voice resonating with false nostalgia. Nana was a woman. With worldliness and culture dot, she placed her glass down and looked directly at me. Her eyes were cold, triumphant. She delivered the final public blow. La clase es algo que no se puede comprar. Class is something you cannot buy. The words hung in the air. The meaning was unmistakable. The insult was public, brutal, and aimed directly at my heart. The handful of Spanish guests who understood shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Delatour stared intently at his dessert plate. Mateo, hearing his ex-girlfriend's name, simply looked confused, a placid frown on his handsome face. He had no idea I had just been publicly executed, and in that moment, something inside me broke. Not my spirit, my patience. The spring that had been coiling tighter and tighter all week finally snapped. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the frustration, it vanished. And what was left was a feeling of absolute liberating calm. The scholar had finished her research. The data was all in. The conclusion was inescapable. I looked at Isabella's smug, satisfied face. I looked at Carmen and Elena, who were trying to hide their smirks behind their wine glasses. I looked at Mateo, my dear, beloved, blind Mateo, and I knew the time for silence was over. The time for observation had ended. I picked up my own wine glass. My hand was perfectly steady. I took a small, deliberate sip, the cool liquid a balm on my dry throat. I set the glass down with a soft, definitive click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. I turned my head and met my future mother-in-law's gaze. My polite, vacant smile was gone. In its place was something she had never seen before. My mind was racing, arranging the catalog of her own words, her own insults, into the sentences that would undo her. I had the language. I had the ammunition. And I had her undivided attention. Showtime. The silence that fell upon the dining room of Las Venas de Plata was a living thing. It was heavier than the ancient oak-beamed ceiling, thicker than the cloying scent of wilting lily at the center of the table. It was a silence born of a perfectly executed act of social cruelty. Isabella's final remark, "Las leyes es algo que no se puede comprar," hung in the air, a drop of poison suspended in time. Class is something you cannot buy. I saw it all, with a new, preternatural clarity. The candlelight flickered across the faces of the guests. The Spanish speakers, the ones who had understood the public execution, stared at me with a profound and exquisite pity. They were embarrassed for me, for my obvious, ignorant bliss. Mr. de la Tour, my kind dinner partner, suddenly found the intricate pattern on his bread plate to be the most fascinating object in the world. The Americans at the far end of the table, oblivious, continued a low murmur about golf. And then there was the tribunal. Carmen and Elena were failing to suppress triumphant cat-like smirks. Isabella sat back in her high-backed chair, a look of serene, regal satisfaction on her face. She had landed the killing blow, and Mateo, my dear Mateo. He looked at his mother, then at me, a slight, confused frown on his handsome face. He knew. The tone was dismissive, but he had missed the content. He registered the way one registers a change in atmospheric pressure, but he did not understand the cataclysm. He reached for my hand under the table, a gesture of comfort for a wound he couldn't see. I did not take it. My moment of decision, the one I had been building towards all week, was not a storm. It was a perfect cold calm. The hurt was gone. The anger had been forged into a tool. The scholar in me had finished her dissertation. The evidence was collected, the thesis was written, and I was now prepared to defend it. My movements were slow, deliberate, each one a small act of theater. I raised my wine glass, the deep red of the Rioja catching the light. I took a small sip, letting the complex vintage roll over my tongue, a vintage they assumed I could not appreciate. I returned the glass to the white linen tablecloth, setting it down with a soft, definitive click. The sound was a punctuation mark, the end of one sentence, the beginning of another. I folded my hands in my lap. I turned my head, my posture serene, and I looked directly into the cold, triumphant eyes of Isabella Vargas, and then I spoke, not in English, not with my unfortunate American accent. I spoke in the language they had used as a shield, as a secret code, as a weapon against me. My Spanish was not the halting, apologetic Spanish of a tourist. It was the flawless, crisp, academic Castilian of a scholar, honed by years of reading 17th century legal documents and arguing the finer points of Baroque art with professors in Madrid. Tiene usted toda la razón, Dona Isabella, I said. My voice was quiet, but it sliced through the silence of the room like a razor. You are absolutely right, Dona Isabella. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if I had thrown a stun grenade onto the table. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. The low murmur about golf died abruptly. Every single head swiveled towards me. I saw Carmen's jaw actually drop. Elena's smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. Isabella's regal composure shattered, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. And Mateo stared at me as if I had just sprouted wings. He looked at me as if he had never seen me before in his life. And in a way, he hadn't. I held Isabella's gaze, and I did not let her go. I continued, my tone even and conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. La clase en efecto no se puede comprar. I continued. Class indeed cannot be bought. Es un concepto fascinante. He pasado muchos ecos estudiándolo en cierto modo. It's a fascinating concept. I have spent many years studying it in a way. I let my gaze drift for a moment to the two sisters. Por ejemplo, he aprendido que algunas personas se harían que la clase se demuestra con ropa de deseco de Milan. For example, I have learned that some people believe class is demonstrated with designer clothes from Milan. Carmen flinched as if I had struck her. O que se define por la capacidad de diferenciar un fino de Jerez de, digamos, una Coca-Cola. Or that it is defined by the ability to tell a dry sherry from, let's say, a Coca-Cola. Elena went pale, the color draining from her face. I turned my attention back to Isabella. Some believe class is a matter of heritage, of history. You mentioned that my country has no history. In one sense, you are correct. Our history is not as long as yours. It is not measured in ancient stones and faded tapestries. I gestured vaguely at the room around us. Our history is louder, messier, more practical, perhaps. I used her own word against her, but I have made the history of Spain my life's work. My doctorate from the Complutense University of Madrid is on the court of Philip IV, specifically on the implicit social and political hierarchies and the domestic portraits of Diego Velázquez. I saw a flicker of genuine horror in Isabella's eyes. I had not just entered her world, I had revealed that I held an academic mastery over it, that she, for all her pride in it, could never match. And if there is one lesson to be learned from the history of your great nation, from the golden age of Velázquez and all the centuries that followed, it is that pride, the unwavering belief in one's own cultural and social superiority, is the very thing that can lead an empire to its knees. An obsession with blood purity, a disdain for the new, a refusal to adapt. It is a story your own history tells with heartbreaking clarity. It is a lesson that, with all due respect, seems to have been forgotten in this house. The silence that followed this was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of annihilation. I had taken their greatest point of pride, their history, their culture, and turned it into a mirror to reflect their own bigotry. The guests were now staring at their plates with an intensity that bordered on the religious. They wanted to be anywhere else. Mr. de la Tour was sweating. And then I looked at Mateo. His face was a wreck of conflicting emotions. The shock was still there, but now there was a dawning, horrified understanding. He was replaying the entire week in his head, but this time he was hearing it in stereo. He was finally understanding the thousand little cruelties he had so cheerfully dismissed. He looked at his mother, then at his sisters, and then at me, and his face was filled with a shame so profound it was almost beautiful. I had one final point to make. I turned my gaze back to Isabella, whose face had hardened into a mask of pure, regal fury. You have been a most gracious hostess. Donna Isabella, I said, my voice still quiet, still calm. You have welcomed me into your magnificent home. You have fed me your exquisite food, and you have taught me a valuable lesson. You have taught me that a person can be surrounded by 400 years of history, art, and culture and still possess none of it. True class, true culture is not something you inherit. It is something you practice. It is the practice of kindness, of empathy, of decency. I let those words hang in the air for a moment. Gracias por la lección, I concluded. Thank you for the lesson. I picked up my napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table beside my plate. My work was done. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered, and the sentences had been served. I had not raised my voice. I had not stooped to their level of name-calling. I had simply taken their own ugly prejudiced words and used the cool, clear light of logic to show them and all of their esteemed guests exactly what they were. The room remained in a state of suspended animation, a tableau of social horror worthy of Goya himself. And I, the quiet, simple American, the international experiment, was the only person in the room who felt completely and utterly at peace. The battle was over, and I had won. The dining room of Las Minas de Plata, a stage that had witnessed centuries of polite, performative family history, was now the scene of a silent social car crash. The 20 guests and 4 members of the Vargas family were frozen in a state of collective shock, their faces illuminated by the soft flickering candlelight that now seemed harsh and interrogating. My final words, gracias por la lección, hung in the air between us, a verdict from which there was no appeal. I looked one last time at the faces of my jury. The guests, to their credit, looked profoundly ashamed to have been witnesses. They stared at their plates, at the ceiling, at the large, grim portrait of the Vargas ancestor on the wall, who seemed to be glaring down with a newfound sense of outrage. And then there was the family. Carmen and Elena looked like they had been slapped, their faces pale and slack with disbelief. Isabella's face was a mask of pure glacial fury, her aristocratic composure shattered, revealing the ugly, throbbing vanity beneath. She was a queen deposed in her own court, and her eyes promised a silent, bloody retribution that I knew I would never have to face. And Matteo, my Matteo, he was looking at me, and his face was the landscape of my entire heartbreak. It was a canvas of shock, dawning horror, and a deep, soul-crushing shame. For the first time, he was not seeing me as his lovely, simple American girlfriend. He was seeing the woman I actually was, a stranger who had been living behind a mask, a scholar who had silently judged him and his entire family, and a fighter who had just single-handedly demolished his whole world. He was finally seeing the truth, and the truth was devastating him. I felt a pang of love and pity for him, a ghost limb of an emotion that no longer had a place in my body. My work here was done. With a calm that I did not feel but could project with absolute perfection, I picked up the linen napkin from my lap and placed it gently on the table. The small, soundless gesture was an act of finality. It was over. I stood up, my chair making a soft scraping sound on the tiled floor. It was the only sound in the entire room. "Thank you for a memorable evening," I said, my voice switching back to clear, unaccented English. The linguistic shift was my final parting shot. It was a signal that I was stepping out of their secret-coded world and back into my own. "Please excuse me." I turned my back straight and walked out of the dining room. I did not run. I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who is completely in control. I could feel every eye in the room on my back. It was not a feeling of vulnerability, but one of immense, liberating power. I made it to the grand, marble-floored foyer before he caught up to me. "Claire." Matteo's voice was a ragged, desperate plea. He grabbed my arm, his touch gentle but firm. I stopped but did not turn to face him. I simply stood there, looking at the massive, dark wood of the front door. "My escape route. Claire, please," he said again, coming around to stand in front of me. His face was ashen. "What? How? I don't understand. You speak Spanish?" "Fluently," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "My PhD is in your country's art. It required a certain level of proficiency." "But you never said anything," he stammered, his mind clearly struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. All week. What they were saying. His voice trailed off as the full, horrifying weight of his own ignorance began to crash down upon him. He remembered every snide remark, every whispered joke, but now he was hearing them in a new, terrible light. "Oh my God," he whispered, his hand going to his mouth. "Claire, I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea. Didn't you?" I asked, and for the first time, I let a sliver of the cold, hard anger I felt into my voice. I finally met his eyes. "Did you need to be fluent in Spanish to hear the contempt in your mother's voice? Did you need a translation for the smug, cruel looks on your sisters' faces? It wasn't about the language, Matteo. It was about cruelty. It was about a deep, arrogant bigotry that you have been surrounded by your entire life. And you didn't see it because you never, ever thought to look. But if you had just told me," he started, his voice pleading for a way to shift the blame. "Told you what?" I interrupted. "That your family were behaving like monsters? Would you have believed me? Or would you have told me I was being too sensitive, that I just didn't understand European families?" I threw his own pathetic excuses back at him. "I gave you a week, Matteo. I gave you every opportunity to be my partner, to be my defender, and you did nothing. You smiled and translated their insults into pleasantries. You left me completely, utterly alone." Tears were welling in his eyes. "I love you, Claire. I know," I said. And that was the saddest part. I knew he did, in his own weak, inadequate way. And I love you, but I love myself more. I will not spend my life with a man who requires me to shrink, to be less than I am, just to keep the peace with his vicious family. I will not be your international experiment. The color drained from his face as I used his sister's words. He finally understood. I had heard it all. I am leaving, Mateo, I said, my voice softening now, the anger replaced by a deep, weary finality. I'm leaving this house tonight. No, wait, we can fix this, he begged, reaching for me again. I'll talk to them. I'll make them apologize. Apologize for what? I asked, stepping back. For being who they are? They are not sorry for what they said. They are only sorry that I understood. There is a difference. And I'm done being their subject of study. I looked at him, at his handsome, heartbroken face, and I delivered the final, necessary cut. You have a choice to make. It's them, or it's me, but I will not be in the same room as them ever again. If you want a future with me, you will have to leave this house, this life, and build a new one, with me, on equal terms. I left him standing there, his face a mask of agony. The choice was his, but I knew with a sad certainty what he would choose. He was a branch of that old rotten tree. He would never have the strength to cut himself free. I walked up the grand, curving staircase to the guest suite. My hands were steady as I packed a small carry-on bag with my essentials, my passport, my wallet, my phone. I left the beautiful clothes I had bought for this trip hanging in the wardrobe. I left the books, the toiletries. I took nothing that belonged to this life. As a final gesture, I took the gaudy silk scarf the sisters had bought me and draped it over the lampshade, a small, ugly flag of their defeat. I walked back down the stairs. Mateo was gone, presumably to face the firing squad in the dining room. I was alone. I walked to the giant front door, turned the heavy, ornate handle, and stepped out into the cool, dark Andalusian night. The air was clean and fresh, a welcome antidote to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. I walked down the stone steps, my practical flats making a soft, crunching sound on the gravel of the driveway. I did not look back. The walk down the long, cypress-lined drive felt like a pilgrimage. On the way in, I had been a nervous girl, hoping for acceptance. On the way out, I was a woman who had just reclaimed her own soul. The house, Las Venas de Plata, which had seemed so grand and intimidating upon my arrival, now looked like a mausoleum in the moonlight, a beautiful, ornate tomb filled with the ghosts of pride and prejudice. I reached the great iron gates at the end of the driveway and stepped out onto the public road. I used my phone to call a taxi from Rhonda, the dispatcher's sleepy voice a comforting intrusion of the real world. As I waited, I looked back one last time at the estate. It was a golden, glowing box of light and misery in the vast darkness. Of the Spanish countryside, my future with Mateo was a painful, unresolved question mark. But my future with myself was, for the first time, a certainty. My revenge had not been a loud, fiery explosion. It had been a quiet, precise, and devastatingly honest sentence. I had not humiliated them. I had simply held up a mirror and allowed them to humiliate themselves. The distant headlights of the taxi appeared, a small, hopeful star on the dark road. I had no idea where I was going to sleep tonight. I had no idea what came next. But as I got into the car and it pulled away, leading the silver vineyards to its silver-tongued inhabitants, I didn't feel scared. I felt free. I had been tested, and I had not been found wanting. The victory was not in their defeat, but in my own survival. The game was over, and I had won. 1 year later, London, the suffocating, sun-drenched heat of Andalusia had been replaced by the cool, gray damp of a British summer. The world of the Vargas family of Las Venas de Plata felt like a scene from a historical novel I had once studied, a dramatic, turbulent chapter that was now firmly in the past. I had finished my dissertation. I was now Dr. Claire Harrison, and I had secured a coveted position as a junior curator of European painting at a prestigious London museum. My life was quiet, ordered, and entirely my own. It was a life built on the foundations of my own scholarship and merit, a life where I was judged by the quality of my work, not the perceived quality of my bloodline. I was happy, or at least, I was content. The rage and the pain had long since faded, leaving behind a smooth, hard scar of caution that I wore like a hidden piece of armor. I had not spoken to Matteo since the night I walked out of his family's life. I had assumed correctly that he had made his choice. He had chosen the gilded cage. My office at the museum was my sanctuary, a small, book-lined room overlooking a quiet garden square. It was my own version of the courtyard at the estate, but this one was a place of safety, not of ambush. It was a Thursday afternoon, the last day of July 2026, and I was drafting a proposal for an upcoming Goya exhibition when an envelope was placed on my desk. It was thick, cream-colored, and the postmark was from Seville, Spain. There was no return address, but I didn't need one. My heart, which had been a calm and steady thing for a year, gave a sudden, violent lurch. My first instinct was to tear it in half, to throw it in the bin and exorcise the ghost before it had a chance to speak. But the scholar in me, the woman, who could not bear to leave a primary source unexamined, took over. My hands were steady as I slid a letter opener under the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery, covered in Matteo's familiar, elegant handwriting. Claire, it began. I am writing this letter with no expectation of a reply, and certainly no expectation of forgiveness. I forfeited my right to either a year ago. I am writing because I owe you an explanation. An apology is not enough for what I allowed to happen. You deserve the truth of the aftermath. Your departure that night was not a pebble dropped in a pond. It was a cannonball. The dinner party became the stuff of legend in Andalusian society, a story of the quiet American who had publicly flayed the Vargas family with their own language. My mother and sisters were humiliated on a scale they had never known. Their social standing, which they valued above all else, was shattered. They had been exposed as cruel provincial bigots, and their friends and rivals delighted in their downfall. But that is not the important part. What is important is what happened next. For the first time in my life, I saw them clearly. I saw the casual cruelty, the suffocating pride, the deep, ugly fear of anything and anyone they deemed beneath them. You didn't just hold up a mirror to them, Claire. You held one up to me. And I was horrified by what I saw, a coward. A weak, blind, complacent boy who had been so coddled by his privilege that he couldn't recognize true strength when it was sitting right beside him. The weeks that followed were the ugliest of my life. I confronted them. I used the words you had used. They did not understand. They blamed you, of course. The foreign witch who had enchanted and then betrayed me. They could not comprehend that. Their own actions were the cause. The rift between us was total. I realized that my choice was not between you and them. It was a choice between a real life and the comfortable, hollow performance of a life they had designed for me. I chose to leave. It took me a year to untangle myself from the family business, to say goodbye to the legacy I had always thought was my destiny. I have moved to Barcelona. I took a job with a small architectural firm, a junior position. I am starting over. I am building something that is my own. I do not write this to win your pity or your praise. I write this because I needed you to know that your act of courage, your refusal to be broken, did not just save yourself. It saved me too. You woke me up. That is a debt I can never repay. I will be in London for a conference next week. If you were willing, I would like to see you, not to ask for a second chance, but to apologize in person as the man I should have been a year ago. If you never want to see my face again, I understand. Either way, Claire, know this. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Yours, Mateo. I folded the letter and sat back in my chair, the quiet of my office suddenly roaring in my ears. The neat, orderly world I had built for myself was once again thrown into chaos. I had consigned him to my past, a painful but necessary sacrifice. But the man who had written this letter was not the man I had left behind in Andalusia. That man was a boy. This man was someone else. And against all my better judgment, my heart, my foolish academic heart, was curious. We met in a small, quiet cafe in Kensington, a neutral ground of my choosing. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. The easy, aristocratic confidence was gone. He was thinner, his face was more angular, and there were lines of weariness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. The expensive, tailored suits had been replaced by a simple, well-worn tweed jacket. He looked real. Claire, he said, his voice quiet. Thank you for coming. Mateo, I replied, my own voice steady. You said in your letter you wanted to apologize. We sat down, and for an hour he talked. He apologized for his weakness, for his blindness, for his cowardice. He did not make a single excuse. He owned his failure completely. He told me about the painful process of separating from his family, of being financially and emotionally cut off. He told me about his small apartment in Barcelona, about the satisfaction he found in his new, anonymous life, a life where he was judged on his own work, not on his family's name. I had to lose everything I thought I wanted, he said, looking down at his coffee cup to realize what I had actually lost, which was you. He finally looked up, and his eyes were clear, free of the shadows of his family. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, he said. My old life, the one I tried to bring you into, it was a prison for both of us, but I'm building a new one now, a better one. And I know this is an impossible question, but I have to ask it. Would you be willing someday to see what that new life might look like? Not as a continuation of what we had, but as a new beginning between the people we are now. I looked at him, at this humble, changed man. The anger I had held onto was gone. The pain was a distant echo. The love I had felt for him, a love I had buried and mourned, was not dead. It was just dormant, waiting. I thought of the cool gray London outside, a city where I had found safety and purpose. I had everything I needed, but did I have everything I wanted? The walls I had built around my heart had kept me safe, but they had also kept me in a state of quiet, perpetual winter. Mateo was not asking to be let back into my fortress. He was asking if I would be willing to step outside of it. A small, genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. It was a smile without artifice, without defense. It was a risk, perhaps, I said. I might be willing to see a blueprint. The hope that dawned in his eyes was as bright and as welcome as the first sun after a long, hard winter. The future was still an unwritten page, but for the first time I felt ready to write it, and I knew with a quiet certainty that I would not be writing it alone.